A soft breeze makes its way over the sea of grass in front of me. The endless expanse of yellow ripples gently with the wind. Small clusters of trees look like little islands, clinging together in the tiniest rises in the land, sitting barely above the layer of water that rests just beneath the blades of grass. From the wooden watchtower I'm standing on, it would seem that this strange mix of swamp and prairie could stretch on forever. Had I stood at that spot 100 years ago, I wouldn't have been too far from the truth. Though today the Everglades are a protected national park, hemmed in by development into the very southern tip of their peninsula, a century ago they were far, far larger. And while Florida was never completely occupied by swampland, for most of American history it was very much a wilderness. Though the very first part of the 50 states ever colonized by Europe, it remained little more than a buffer colony for Imperial Spain, and a place that, while technically under American control, the country exercised little real power over. This was a place that provided haven for pirates that roved the Gulf and Caribbean, where the U.S. government and the peninsula's native inhabitants engaged in battle against one another up until the beginning of the Civil War. This was an American frontier, not in the far mountain west of the country, but on the East Coast, the otherwise population center of America, a sparsely populated land of cattle ranchers, sugarcane and citrus farmers, and indigenous tribes living in a vast wetland, a humid and dangerous wilderness of terrifying storms and dinosaur-like swamp monsters. While across the continent, San Francisco boasted hundreds of thousands of people, its rise marking the ever-increasing development of the American West, Florida remained a backwater just beneath the urban centers of the eastern seaboard, its largest city a trading outpost only accessible by boat. Today, palmetto-covered marshland and sandy barrier islands have been transformed into rises of glass and steel, cul-de-sacs, golf courses, and planned communities extending suburbia to the edges of this new frontier, a modern-day colony carved into a land thought impossible to develop. In a whirlwind of a century, this American backwater has become a population giant, surpassing even the Empire State of New York, to become the third most populous state in the country, a moment that capped off a period of remarkable growth. Someone in their 80s would have lived to see much of this transformation within their lifetime. If you were born in 1940, you would have watched the Sunshine State grow 11-fold, from 1.8 to more than 22 million. That's the equivalent of 80 years from now, Idaho surpassing New York, and Florida's radical remaking would have seemed just as improbable then as that scenario seems to us today. Home to not just the country's fourth largest urban area, but 10 of its 100 largest population centers, its most visited city, its third largest skyline, Florida is an incredibly diverse state that year after year, decade after decade, has been one of the fastest growing places in America, a place whose name is known the world over. This is that story. I'm in Miami Beach. Behind me, you can see the skyline of the city of Miami, the country's fourth largest urban area and the largest in the state of Florida. It's a center of banking, of transportation, of trade, a major port of entry, and center of tourism, and its growth has been testament to the growth that the state has seen overall. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host, Carter. This is the U.S. Explained, episode 28, Florida. According to the Köppen climate classification, most of Florida sits in the humid subtropical climate zone with hot summers, mild winters, and high humidity. If you're familiar with this series, you're probably used to this climate zone as that of America's hot and humid south. Florida, though, is so far south that it dips into even hotter climates. A strip of southeast Florida, including Miami and its suburbs, are part of the rainforest, and further south and inland the monsoon climate zones, while the rest of South Florida from the Gulf of Mexico to the Florida Keys is part of the savanna climate zone. The rainforest climate zone is marked by very high rainfall, hot temperatures, and practically no real seasons, while the savanna climate gets less rainfall with a notable dry season in the winter, and the monsoon climate is somewhere in between the two. Though not technically located in the tropics itself, if going by latitude lines, these are considered tropical climate zones, giving South Florida the only tropical climate in the mainland U.S. With an average relative humidity of 74.5%, it's the second most humid state in the country after Alaska looking at relative humidity and Hawaii if looking at dew point, more a measurement of how sticky the air actually feels. Additionally, it's the second hottest state in the U.S. with an average temperature of 71.8 degrees Fahrenheit or 22.1 degrees Celsius, surpassed by only Hawaii. The Sunshine State is ranked 10th by average annual sunlight, the highest on the East Coast. It's the fourth rainiest state as well, getting 54.73 inches of rainfall a year, surpassed by just its fellow Gulf Coast states of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Florida rarely gets any snow, and if it does, it's typically up north. In an average year, Florida gets a minuscule hundredth of an inch of snow, less than only Hawaii. In South Florida, for example, the last time it snowed was 1977, thought to be the only time snow fell there in the last 200 years. The state is infamous for one natural disaster in particular: hurricanes. 40% of all hurricanes in U.S. history have hammered Florida, and some of the deadliest and costliest in recent memory, including Hurricanes Ian, Milton, Katrina, Helene, and Irma, have struck the state, though some caused more damage in Florida than others. The state has the second lowest average elevation, just 100 feet above sea level. Its highest point, a spot on the Alabama border called Britton Hill, sits at just 345 feet above sea level, the lowest of any state high point, giving it a difference between high and low point that makes it the flattest state in the country. On top of that, a Kansas University study done by some Kansan geographers frustrated by the state's flat reputation found that, according to an analysis of each state's landscape shape, Florida was by that measure too the country's flattest state. Both very flat and incredibly low-lying, parts of Miami even sit beneath sea level. Hurricanes, floods, land subsidence, and rising sea levels pose a very real threat to Florida, and flooding is an all-too-common occurrence. Most hills are in the Panhandle and are very small, but a long ridge of low sandy hills called the Lake Wales Ridge stretches south down the center of the peninsula from Orlando, remnants of a prehistoric island chain that existed when the peninsula was underwater. Surprisingly, for a state located on the East Coast, Florida is actually split between two time zones. Most of the state is in Eastern time, but Florida's panhandle stretches so far west that 9 of its counties and part of another are located in the Central time zone. Florida is famously nicknamed the Sunshine State. Famed for its beaches and warm weather, it's a fitting nickname as the state has embraced its role as a major tourism and retirement destination. Its most common license plate shows the nickname along with the state in green and 2 oranges, representative of the state's historic role as a major citrus producer. The name Florida is an anglicized version of a Spanish word meaning flowered. It comes from Juan Ponce de Leon, the first European to land on the peninsula. But it's unclear whether La Florida, his name for it, was meant to refer to flowers he saw growing on the shore and meant the flowered land, or whether it came from La Pascua Florida, the festival of flowers, a Spanish name for Easter Sunday, the day when Ponce de Leon first sighted land. Florida's flag represents this Spanish history. It shows a red saltire on a white background based off of the Cross of Burgundy, the flag of Imperial Spain, with Florida's state seal on top of the cross. I don't typically love state seals on flags, but Florida's works. It's a nice looking seal showing a Seminole woman scattering flowers along the coast as the sun sets and a boat passes behind a palmetto tree. Florida was one of the first places in the first state I visited on my US Explained filmmaking tour of the country. I spent a week and a half traveling across the state, visiting Florida's north, south, center, the Panhandle, and the Keys, and most of its major cities. I was lucky enough to be able to spend time across much of Florida, and many of the photos and video clips you see in this video, though not all, I took myself on site, including the thumbnail. If you have a guess as to where the thumbnail was taken, let me know in the comments. This should be a pretty easy one. At 53,625 square miles, or 138,887 square kilometers, Florida is the 26th largest state in the country, pretty much right in the middle. It's a little smaller than Wisconsin and a little larger than Arkansas, about the size of Tajikistan or Bangladesh. After Georgia, it's the second largest state on the East Coast. Though fairly average in terms of land area, Florida has an enormous population, the third largest in the country and the largest we've covered so far in this series. 22.61 million people live within its borders, more than any other state in the country besides California and Texas, even more than New York, and similar to countries like Mali and Sri Lanka. Together, California, Texas, and Florida are the country's big three states, population giants that play an enormously outsized role in the economy, culture, and politics of the modern United States. For comparison, add up the populations of the U.S.'s 16 least populous states, which together make up more than a third of the entire country's land area, and Florida is still home to more people. Were Florida an independent country, its economy, the fourth largest in the U.S., would be the 16th largest on the planet, larger than that of huge countries like Indonesia or Turkey. Not only does Florida have a huge population, but it has one that's growing incredibly fast as well. Most of this population growth has been within the last century and has continued into the present day. Since 1940, it's been the third fastest growing state in the entire country, growing at a ridiculously rapid rate of 1,035%, more than 11 times over. Only Nevada and Arizona have grown faster during that time period. Since 2008, Florida's had the fourth highest average growth rate in the country, growing its population by an additional 1.34% on average every year, surpassed by only Utah, Idaho, and Texas. The state has been a huge beneficiary of post-pandemic population shifts as well. In 2022, it was the country's fastest growing state and was second to only South Carolina in 2023. All in all, an additional million people call Florida home today who didn't in 2020. This huge population in a relatively medium-sized state gives Florida a high population density, 422 people per square mile or 163 per square kilometer, making it the seventh most densely populated state in the country. Each state with a higher population density is a small northeastern state, and altogether they take up far less land in total than Florida. Florida sits in the very southeastern corner of the U.S. mainland. It's the southernmost state we've covered so far and the southernmost in the contiguous lower 48 states overall. Only Hawaii and some of the U.S. territories are further south. The island town of Key West in the Florida Keys is the southernmost town in the lower 48, marked by this concrete buoy, though parts of the island itself are further south, and a tiny island called Ballast Key is a little further south as well. Cape Sable in the Everglades is the southernmost point of the U.S. mainland. With this video, we are completely done covering the east coast of the United States. There are no states left in the U.S. explained sitting on the Atlantic, though we still have 2 territories left that are. The mainland's southernmost state is unsurprisingly located in the region known as the South, but despite sitting further to the south, it typically is not considered, besides perhaps some parts of the Panhandle, to be part of the Deep South. Something of a cultural anomaly, closer in much of the state to Latin America and the Caribbean, and home to millions of transplants and retirees from the Northeast and Midwest. Florida's north is considered the most culturally southern, while South Florida is ironically typically not thought to be part of the American South, but its own distinct region instead. It borders 2 other states and shares a water border with 2 countries. Georgia and Alabama sit to its north, and though we typically think of the U.S. as bordering just Canada and Mexico, Cuba and the Bahamas sit so close to Florida to share water borders in the Atlantic and Straits of Florida with the state. Florida's east coast sits on the open Atlantic Ocean and its west coast on the Gulf of Mexico. To its south, the 2 are connected by the Straits of Florida, a passage between the peninsula and the island countries of Cuba and the Bahamas that's a major shipping route into the Gulf and its major coastal port cities like Houston and New Orleans, as well as the waterways of the Mississippi River. Almost entirely surrounded by water, the state has the second longest coastline in the country after just Alaska, and the second most islands, over 4,500 after Alaska as well. Its border with Georgia begins at the Atlantic at the mouth of the St. Mary's River near Fernandina Beach and follows the river inland to its headwaters in the Okefenokee Swamp, where it then cuts west in a slightly diagonal line for 157 miles or 254 kilometers to a reservoir called Lake Seminole. It follows the Chattahoochee River briefly upstream from the lake until it turns west once more and the border with Georgia becomes a border with Alabama. It then continues west for 153 miles, or 247 kilometers, before meeting the Perdido River, which it follows south to its mouth in the Gulf of Mexico, ending near the Florida town of Perdido Key and the Alabama town of Orange Beach. The rest of the state, besides the Panhandle, about 80% of Florida's land, consists of the Florida Peninsula. This is the largest peninsula in the United States, unless you consider the entirety of Alaska to be a peninsula, and where most Floridians live. It abruptly juts 450 miles south from the rest of the continent, hemming in and separating the Gulf of Mexico from the rest of the Atlantic Ocean. It reaches so close to the islands of the Caribbean that people living in Miami are physically closer to Havana and Nassau than to Jacksonville or Tallahassee. The Panhandle, meanwhile, stretches far to the west. Florida is about 400 miles long east to west, so though the state isn't particularly large, its boomerang-like shape means that a drive from Pensacola near the Alabama border to Key West in the Florida Keys with no stops would take somewhere between 12 to 13 hours. That's somehow slightly longer than a drive across California from San Diego to the Oregon border, and this one really surprised me, a drive across Texas from El Paso to Port Arthur, two far larger states. It also means that nowhere in the state is more than 74 miles from the ocean. As with Michigan, because much of the state is a thin peninsula, it doesn't have too many rivers that are particularly long. In the Panhandle, its largest river system is that of the Apalachicola, which, like other Panhandle rivers, briefly passes through the state, flowing south into the Gulf from Georgia and Alabama. It's formed at the Georgia border by the confluence of the much longer Chattahoochee and Flint rivers, the former of which drains the Appalachians in northern Georgia. The Suwannee River, formed in the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia, flows slowly through a series of beautiful wetlands to its mouth in the Gulf in the northern part of the peninsula. The longest river fully within the state is the St. Johns, which forms in the swamps just west of the beach town of Sebastian. There's only a 30-foot drop in elevation along the entirety of the river's 310-mile course, and water can take over a month to reach the Atlantic, at times flowing so slow, just a third of a mile an hour, that it's functionally a lake. Near Jacksonville, where it meets the ocean, it becomes 3 miles wide, wider than the Mississippi. The last water system I'll talk about is one of the most unique in the country, the Everglades. The waters of the Kissimmee River, which drains much of central Florida near Orlando, feed Lake Okeechobee, the country's 9th largest natural lake. From Okeechobee, the water flows out to the ocean through a number of waterways, including the Caloosahatchee River, which meets the Gulf at Fort Myers and Cape Coral. Most of it seeps slowly beneath the grasses and trees in a slow-moving river that's up to 50 miles wide, but often just a few feet or even a few inches deep. Called the Everglades, this incredible wetland brings the waters of Okeechobee to the Gulf, the Atlantic, and the Straits of Florida, and though much has been successfully protected, has been heavily altered by humans, channeled into drainage canals that crisscross South Florida. The Miami River itself is a natural but heavily altered drainage of the Everglades. Right now, I'm at the southern edge of the Florida Peninsula. Behind me is Florida Bay. You can see maybe out there some little islands dotting the bay, and on the other side, out of sight, are the Florida Keys. This is also part of Everglades National Park, a beautiful, vast wetland that's part of the largest protected wilderness area east of the Mississippi River, and a beautiful swampland with a wide variety of biomes and habitats. It's a spectacular national park and wilderness area that much of the urban areas of South Florida were carved out of. The Everglades are a beautiful area and one of the state's 3 national parks, all located in southern Florida. Because parts of Florida are so far from one another, its regions, culturally at least, can be incredibly distinct from one another, despite having only more minor changes in landscape and climate than some other states. We'll start with the Panhandle, perhaps the state's most overlooked region. It makes up 20% of the state's land, but is home to only 7% of its population, about 1.56 million people. This is no small number. It's more than the just over a million who collectively live in the Gulf Coast of neighboring Alabama and Mississippi, but compared to the more than 21 million who inhabit the peninsula, it's minuscule. A long, thin strip along the coast, some 250 miles in length, it's wedged between the Gulf of Mexico and neighboring Georgia and Alabama, which are never very far to the north. This is the most culturally southern part of the state of Florida. If you need to remember one thing about the cultural differences of the state, it should be this saying, which Floridians say all the time. The more north you go, the more southern it gets, or vice versa. The lower 48's southernmost state isn't considered part of the Deep South like its northern neighbors, but if any part of the state can lay claim to that region, it's the Panhandle. This is a rural region, the most rural of the state. There are plenty of rural, even wilderness areas across the peninsula, but the difference is there you are never very far from a major city. The cities of the Panhandle, though there are a number of them, are significantly smaller than those of the peninsula. Wetlands, including forests like the beautiful Apalachicola National Forest, line the coast, as do barrier islands and sandy spits, separated from their mainland by bays and estuaries. Much of the land is agricultural, not the citrus groves or sugarcane fields that Florida is famous for, but crops more typical of the South, like cotton and peanuts, as well as livestock. The Gulf Coasts of Alabama and Mississippi are quite small. It's only an hour's drive from Florida to Mississippi through Alabama, and as the crow flies, Pensacola is closer to New Orleans than to its fellow panhandle city of Tallahassee. Because of this, the Panhandle is in many cases far more similar to coastal Alabama and Mississippi than to, say, South Florida. This multi-state stretch of the Gulf Coast was even politically unified for a long time, part of the colony of West Florida under Spain and Britain. This is a relatively more affordable vacation destination, popular in particular with working-class Americans, especially from neighboring southern states. For many people in Georgia and Alabama, this is the closest place to go to the beach, and it's known for stunningly white sands. The coast of the western part of the Panhandle in particular is heavily developed. The region's largest urban area, Pensacola, is a beach town of about 390,000 people in it and its suburbs that was among the first European settlements in what would become the United States. Other popular beach towns like Fort Walton Beach, Destin, and Panama City form a string of built-up vacation destinations along the Panhandle's Gulf Coast. Besides the beach towns, the Panhandle's other main city is Tallahassee, a small city of about 252,000 in it and its suburbs. It's Florida's capital city as well as a college town, home to two major universities, Florida State University as well as Florida A&M, the state's largest historically black college and university. The Capitol building in Tallahassee is an interesting one. It's one of just a few skyscraper capitals in the country, along with Louisiana, Nebraska, and North Dakota state houses. In my opinion, it's a somewhat boring-looking office building with everything housed in one tower, but there's some pretty cool aspects of it. It's the tallest building in the city, and the top of the tower, which is open to the public, offers sweeping 360-degree views of Tallahassee. Besides, when the current building was built, they kept the previous Capitol building standing as a museum of Florida's government and political history. It's a great museum and a beautiful building. Palm trees, magnolias, and oaks covered in Spanish moss line the grounds, and it combines the traditional neoclassical style with a Capitol dome and pillars typically used in state capitol buildings with unmistakable Florida elements, including a beautiful relief of the state seal and red and white awnings, the colors of Florida's flag, over the windows.
Hi everyone, I'm here in the city of Tallahassee, Florida. Now right behind me is the old historic Capitol building of Florida, and if you see that tower, that skyscraper behind that, that's Florida's current Capitol building. It's one of the tallest Capitol buildings in the United States, and it's the tallest building in the city of Tallahassee. Now Tallahassee is located in Florida's Panhandle. It's a region that's the least populous part of the state, and it's more culturally connected to the Deep South and neighboring sort of Gulf Coast regions of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And Tallahassee is real far from a lot of Florida's population, but back when the state was founded, the two main cities were Pensacola and St. Augustine, the old Spanish cities. And Tallahassee was picked as a midpoint between the two. So it existed as almost a population center at the time. Because of that, it was one of the first American cities founded in Florida, and has been one of the oldest and more historic cities in the state, and remains the capital city to this day.
Further east, the northern part of the peninsula remains a fairly culturally southern part of the state, though one quite different from the Panhandle. For much of the state's history, most Floridians lived in the north of the state, while the central and southern parts were primarily undeveloped swampland. Both northeastern Florida and the Panhandle have large black populations, descendants of enslaved people forced to work on plantations in the agricultural region, while most white people in the area trace their ancestry to English and Scots-Irish settlers, similar to much of the South. Like the Panhandle, there's a large agricultural presence in northeastern Florida, as well as a number of spectacular swamps and wetlands. The northern Florida Gulf Coast has very few beaches and is mostly wetland, and as such remains mostly undeveloped wilderness, save for a few scattered small towns, many of whose houses are built on stilts to protect from floods and hurricanes. Wetlands line the Suwannee and St. Johns rivers, and the Okefenokee Swamp, inland on the Georgia border, is the largest blackwater swamp on the continent. From the Suwannee Valley to Ocala, much of northeastern Florida is agricultural, mostly growing hay and peanuts. Many of these inland towns, like Ocala and Live Oak, were founded before the state's land boom and look much more like older southern towns, centered around built-up business districts rather than the sprawling planned communities that are ubiquitous across much of the Sunshine State. The northeastern Florida city of Gainesville in this agricultural region is home to 213,000 people in it and its suburbs, and is a college town centered around the University of Florida, whose more than 60,000 students make it the fifth largest university in the United States. Most people in northeastern Florida, though, live along the Atlantic coast, primarily in the city of Jacksonville. Though the state's largest city by population within the city limits, helped by the fact that it merged with its county, Duval, a move which made it one of the country's largest cities by land area, it's fourth when looking at urban area, which includes the city and its suburbs. It's 1.25 million residents, making it the state's fourth largest urban area, smaller than Providence but larger than Salt Lake City. Just south of the Georgia border at the mouth of the St. Johns River, some of its far suburbs even stretch across into its northern neighbor. It's the urban core of northeastern Florida and the first of a string of cities that stretch down the entire east coast of the state all the way to Miami.
Hi, I'm right here. We're at the mouth of the St. Johns River, the very northern coast of Florida, and behind me is the city of Jacksonville. Now this is Florida's largest city by city limits and the fourth largest urban area in the state behind Miami, the Tampa Bay Area, and Orlando. And Jacksonville is one of the oldest cities in the state. It was one of the first American towns founded after Florida was taken from Spain and became a U.S. territory. And not far away from here on the coast by Amelia Island, the first of the sea islands that go up the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, was Fort Caroline, where the French first tried to encroach south into near where the Spanish had set up in St. Augustine.
Not far south, the city of St. Augustine is easily the most historic in the state. The old capital of Spanish Florida, it's the oldest continuously inhabited city in the 50 states that was founded by Europeans, founded in 1565. And is famed for its old Spanish colonial churches and forts. A little cobbled alleyway called Aviles Street is even thought to be the oldest road in the 50 states.
Hi, I'm here in St. Augustine, Florida. This is the oldest continually inhabited European settlement in what is now the 50 states. This was the heart of the old Spanish colony of Florida, and when Florida was divided into East and West Florida, this was the capital of the Eastern Colony.
Further south, Palm Coast is a classic example of later planned developments in Florida, a suburban sprawl of cul-de-sacs and canals whose business district is a string of strip malls. Built in 1969 and only incorporated as a city in 1999, it's already home to nearly 100,000 people. Central Florida also has a major agricultural presence. Florida is known for its citrus production, and as development has continued to expand into old agricultural areas in South Florida, Central Florida increasingly remains the heart of Florida citrus production, though the industry there has continued to decline as development spreads as well. 17% of citrus fruits in the U.S. are grown in Florida, mostly oranges, making it second in both to California. The state's second to California in tomato production as well, and industry also centered in Central Florida. Most of the California tomatoes, though, are used for processing into things like tomato sauce and ketchup, and a little more than half of fresh market tomatoes in the U.S., tomatoes you would buy whole in a store, are from Florida. Central Florida, though, is perhaps the most developed part of the state, home to half of Florida's 10 largest urban areas. South of Palm Coast, Daytona Beach, a coastal town, home to the world-famous Daytona International Speedway, the site of one of the world's most famous auto races, the Daytona 500, anchors an urban area of 402,000, the 10th largest in the state. Further south, towns like Titusville, Cocoa Beach, Melbourne, and Palm Bay, together home to some 500,000 people, surround a bend on a barrier island called Cape Canaveral, whose Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Space Force Station is the country's busiest rocket launch site. Port Canaveral at the Cape is the second busiest cruise port on the planet, with some 6.9 million cruise ship passengers visiting the port every year.
Hi, I'm at Cape Canaveral, Florida. This is home to the Kennedy Space Center, a site where the Apollo 11 rocket launch and a number of other famous rocket launches took place, and today remains a major space center on the Atlantic coast. Behind me is the Indian River Lagoon. It separates Cape Canaveral and other barrier islands from the Florida Peninsula. Now, this series of inland waterways has been connected with a number of canals to create the Intracoastal Waterway, a protected waterway that allows shipping to pass along the eastern coast of much of the United States as well as the Gulf Coast. This is also an area where famous Florida wildlife like manatees thrive in these brackish water lagoons. And nearby Port Canaveral is a major center of shipping and a major cruise ship destination.
West of Cape Canaveral, Florida's third largest urban area, Orlando, is its largest inland city. 7,500 lakes are located in the state, and Central Florida is filled with many of them. Its limestone bedrock peppered with countless sinkholes that have filled with water, making many near-perfect circles. Orlando alone has over 100 lakes in its city limits. The city, whose suburbs have expanded to absorb historic towns like Sanford and Kissimmee, has grown in large part thanks to its role as the amusement park capital of the eastern U.S., a growth spurred by Disney's decision to open its flagship amusement park and resort complex, Disney World, in what was then the small citrus farming city. Today, Orlando is the third largest urban area in the state and the 26th largest in the country, home to 1.85 million people in it and its suburbs, making it larger than San Juan, Puerto Rico, and smaller than Sacramento. It's also the most visited city in the entire United States. You might be surprised that a huge city like New York or Los Angeles doesn't hold this title, but while those cities are major draws for international travelers, Orlando, home to no less than 18 amusement parks, is a huge destination for domestic tourists, particularly families and people from the heavily populated eastern half of the country, to which it's closer than Los Angeles, the only other city that even remotely rivals it in terms of number of major theme parks. All in all, 75.8 million people visit Orlando every year. That's more than go to New York, LA, Chicago, or any other city or town in the country.
Hi everyone, I'm here in Orlando, Florida. This is the third largest urban area in the state. And not too long ago, this was a small agricultural citrus farming town. But with the arrival of Walt Disney World to open their amusement park here, a bunch of other amusement parks followed, and today it's one of the largest tourism destinations in the entire world, and it's grown into one of Florida's largest cities.
Florida overall is an enormous tourist destination. After New York, it's the second most visited state by foreign tourists, and the second most visited state overall after California, with over 140 million visitors each year. In general, it's the state that most Americans have been to. 61% of Americans have visited Florida at least once in their life, a larger proportion than have visited any other state. Northwest of Orlando, between it and Ocala, is a town called The Villages. This is another massive planned city, 171,000 people in its urban area, and the entire city itself is an age-restricted private community. Nobody under 19 years old can live there, and each home must have at least one resident older than 55. Just like Palm Coast and countless other Florida towns, there's no real city center or business district whatsoever, just a sprawling expanse of golf courses, cul-de-sacs, and row after row of identical houses. Florida is home to, after California, the country's second largest population of people 65 and older, 4.6 million people. 21.3% of the state, more than a fifth of its residents, are older than 65, the second highest proportion in the country after just Maine. But unlike Maine, West Virginia, Vermont, and other states with high proportions of seniors, Florida does not have an aging population because young people are moving away, but because seniors are moving in. The state is the country's largest destination for retired people to relocate, including many snowbirds, people who spend their summers in colder northern states where they're from, but live in warmer states like Florida in the winter. Towns and neighborhoods like the Villages, intended for seniors to move to, exist all over the state, and along with countless golf courses, hotels, second homes, and resorts, are indicative of a state whose development revolved around leisure. Cities like Lakeland and Winter Haven, southwest of Orlando, have ballooned as people, not just seniors, have moved to Central Florida from all over the country within the last century. Generally, though, most of the transplants have been from the colder northern states, not the south, and so many moved into Florida that Central Florida is culturally much less like the South. Many movers settled where the highways would take them. I-75, which goes down Florida's west coast, goes to the Midwest, so most Midwesterners who moved to Florida went to the western side of the state, while I-95, originating in the Northeast, brought Northeasterners in. I was surprised, for example, to see so many Minnesota Twins fans packing their spring training stadium in Fort Myers and so many Wawas, a Philly convenience store, on the drive from Orlando to Miami. Orlando, too, has become a massive destination for Puerto Ricans moving to the mainland and is surpassed in the 50 states by only New York City in terms of the size of its Puerto Rican population. When it comes to proportion of the population, Orlando is the most Puerto Rican major metro area on the U.S. mainland, many living in suburbs like Kissimmee. Even larger than Orlando on the Gulf Coast of Central Florida is the state's second largest urban area and the 17th largest in the country. Home to 2.78 million people, the Tampa Bay Area, centered around the larger city of Tampa and its smaller twin, St. Petersburg, as well as other cities like Clearwater, is smaller than the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul and larger than Denver. Florida's number 2 is a sprawling metropolis alongside the state's best natural harbor, Tampa Bay.
I'm at the Riverwalk in downtown Tampa, Florida. Its location on Tampa Bay, an excellent natural harbor, has long made it a major port city, and for a long time it was the global center of the cigar manufacturing industry. Today, along with neighboring St. Pete, it's the core of Florida's second largest urban area after just Miami, home to nearly 3 million people.
Tampa's suburbs stretch north along the Gulf, and south of the bay, the cities of Bradenton, Sarasota, and Venice sit side by side in an amalgamation of 779,000 people, together the 5th largest urban area in the state, little separating their suburbs from those of Tampa. In fact, you could drive from Sarasota through Tampa, Lakeland, and Orlando to Daytona on the other coast of the state and encounter very little land that isn't developed. A large Italian-American presence in Tampa gives Florida the largest Italian-American community in the South. Finally, we get to South Florida, the state's most well-known region, and one of the most culturally unique places in the entire country. Development in South Florida is almost entirely limited to the coasts. Save for a few small farming towns around Lake Okeechobee, Florida produces more than half of the country's sugarcane, and much of it is grown just south of the lake. The interior of South Florida is almost entirely uninhabited. The unique ecosystem of the Everglades, which South Florida is located in, protected through Everglades National Park and a number of other preserves and wildlife refuges. A pair of large bays, Charlotte Harbor and Pine Island Sound, cut inland from the Gulf, and sprawling developments like the unfinished, half-built cities of Northport, Port Charlotte, and Cape Coral sit alongside them. Fort Myers sits along the Caloosahatchee River from Cape Coral, and together the two are home to 599,000 people, making them the 6th largest urban area in the state. Further south, development continues along the Gulf through towns like Bonita Springs and Naples, all the way to Marco Island, together home to a collective 425,000 residents. But beyond Marco Island, the Gulf Coast is untouched wild Everglades. Only 2 major roads, the Tamiami Trail and the famed Alligator Alley, cut east to west through the glades. Florida has 1.3 million alligators, second to only Louisiana, and though the Everglades is where they can best be found in the wild, in a state built upon a swamp, humans have encroached upon their natural habitat, and they can be found practically everywhere. The famously absurd Florida Man headlines often involve Floridians and some ridiculous story that plenty of times includes gators. Florida's hot, humid climate and wetland ecosystem make it a habitat for wildlife that typically can't be found anywhere else in the country. It's the only place in the United States where crocodiles or flamingos can be found, and the shallow bays and lagoons that line the state's coast are frequented by manatees, as well as loggerheads and other sea turtles. One of the state's most famous species is the Florida panther. Once common across the southern U.S., the only puma species east of the Mississippi is now heavily endangered, and only about 200 remain, mostly in the Everglades. On the east coast of South Florida, wedged between the Everglades and the Atlantic, sits the largest urban area in the state, and the 4th largest in the country. Though fewer than 500,000 people live within its city limits, Miami anchors a massive string of development stretching along the Atlantic coast of South Florida, alongside smaller hubs like Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach, which are heavily built-up cities in their own right. Fort Lauderdale, home to the massive Port Everglades. Together, the Miami urban area is home to 6.08 million people in the city and its suburbs, making it the fourth largest in the country. That's more people than live in the urban areas of other massive American cities like Houston, Dallas, Philadelphia, or the San Francisco Bay Area. And only the country's big three urban areas, New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, surpass it. Just for comparison, more people live in Greater Miami than the entire states of Wisconsin, Colorado, or Minnesota. It has more residents than 31 different states. This fast-growing young city has the third largest skyline in the country, boasting more skyscrapers than any American city besides New York and Chicago, and has a culture shaped by an incredibly diverse combination of people from all over the world. South Florida is a major tourist destination, and like much of the state, has drawn in vacationers, retirees, and snowbirds from other parts of the country, particularly northeastern cities like New York and Philadelphia. Jewish Americans from the Northeast have flocked to Miami and its suburbs, making it the second most Jewish metro area outside New York City, and Florida the most Jewish state in America outside the Northeast. Perhaps more than any other group, though, it's been immigrants to Miami from Latin America and the Caribbean that have shaped South Florida's culture. Cuban Americans in particular have flocked to South Florida. Miami itself is nearly a third Cuban American, but a diverse array of immigrants from across Latin America, such as Colombians, Venezuelans, Dominicans, Panamanians, and Nicaraguans have followed, as well as a substantial number of Puerto Ricans and immigrants from non-Spanish-speaking Caribbean countries, such as Haitians, Jamaicans, and Bahamians. It's one of the country's most truly bilingual cities. 70% of the city itself speaks Spanish, the most of any major American city, as does 40% of its entire metro area, surpassed by only Los Angeles when it comes to metros with over 1 million residents. A booming center of business, finance, and tourism, as well as a multinational metropolis serving as one of the country's major immigration destinations, this densely populated string of cities carved out of the Everglades has given South Florida a Caribbean and Latin American culture distinct from the rest of the state and the country.
A century ago, this was just a small resort town on the edge of the Everglades. Today, Miami is the fourth largest urban area in the country and a global center of finance, shipping, trade, transportation, as well as a major port of entry into the United States that's grown home to a large multicultural community from around Latin America, the Caribbean, and the United States. The growth of Miami has been a driving factor in the growth of the state of Florida and really represents the vast changes that have occurred in the state in the last 100 years.
North of the Miami area, the coastal city of Port St. Lucie and nearby towns like Fort Pierce are together home to around 437,000 people in their urban area. Miami is the southernmost major city on the country's east coast, and south of it, its suburbs peter out into one of the last remaining citrus-growing regions of South Florida, called the Redlands, an agricultural area on the brink of increasing suburban development. Miami in general has some of the strangest patterns of development in the country. The city's suburbs line the coast in a long, thin strand, and neighborhoods, instead of gently transitioning to lower density rural areas, are abruptly cut off as they reach the Everglades, suburbs sitting side by side with practically uninhabited wilderness. Beyond Miami, the barrier islands, which until there closely hug the shore, stretch off of the mainland, forming a body of water called Biscayne Bay, many of whose islands and reefs are protected as Biscayne National Park. 800 islands stretch southwest of the southern tip of the peninsula for 180 miles, the famous Florida Keys. 80,000 people live on the tiny islands, many of which are almost entirely built up. One road, nicknamed the Overseas Highway, connects this string of island communities, home to resorts, vacation homes, and maritime communities of divers, fishermen, and boaters. The last developed island is Key West. Once one of the largest cities in the state, the lower 48's southernmost town is a historic port and strategic military base guarding the vital straits of Florida.
Hi everyone, I'm in the beautiful city of Key West, Florida. Today this is a smaller city popular with vacationers. But for a long time, Key West was the largest city in the entire state of Florida, despite being disconnected from the population centers far to the north by hundreds of miles of ocean and nearly uninhabited swamp. I'm on a dock over the Straits of Florida. To my right, about 100 miles away, is the island of Cuba. I'm actually closer to Havana right now than Miami. And the island's location on these straits and their vital shipping lanes allowed a city to develop here that was for a long time a center of cigar manufacturing, wreck salvaging, sponge diving, as well as a major military fortification, which it remains today. This is one of Florida's oldest and most historic cities, and a really beautiful and culturally unique place at the end of this spectacular island chain.
Beyond Key West, the chain ends with the tiny keys that make up Florida's third national park, Dry Tortugas, home to the island fortress of Fort Jefferson. Only accessible by a seaplane or a 2-hour boat ride from Key West, it's among the least visited national parks in the country. The land that is now Florida was originally home to a number of different indigenous peoples. The Panhandle was home to the Pensacola in the west, the Chattit in the center, and the Appalachee in the east. Most of the northern peninsula was dominated by the Timucua, while the Ace lived along much of central Florida's east coast, and the Tocobaga surrounded Tampa Bay. The Guacata and Miami, who would lend their name to a nearby river and eventually the city that developed on its mouth, lived along the shores of Lake Okeechobee, and the Jaega lived along the Atlantic coast east of the lake. South Florida was home to the Tequesta on the Atlantic coast and the Calusa on the Gulf Coast, as well as the Matacumbe and the Keys. When Spain, the first European power to encounter and begin exploring and colonizing the Americas, launched their first voyages of discovery, they went not to the closest part of North America nor the lands at the same latitude. Either would have brought them to the northeastern states or Canada's Atlantic provinces, but instead they followed the best wind patterns. Winds in the North Atlantic off the coast of Spain typically blew east to west, which would have made the journey incredibly difficult, whereas further to the south, winds off the coast of Africa blew west to east. Called the trade winds, they made the journey across the Atlantic significantly quicker. Spain used the Canary Islands, a volcanic archipelago that they'd colonized off the coast of North Africa, as a staging ground and resupply point for their New World expeditions. Christopher Columbus and other conquistadors and explorers sailing for Spain would typically head south to the Canaries, then take the trade winds from there across the Atlantic. And the trade winds typically dumped them in the same region, the Caribbean. Columbus first sighted land in the Bahamas, and Spain's first colonial settlements would be centered around the islands of the Indies, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Cuba, and Jamaica. In 1511, Juan Ponce de León, the former Spanish colonial governor of Puerto Rico, was replaced in a political power struggle with Columbus's son. Spain's King Ferdinand II instead offered León the island of Bimini, a rich island said to be north of Cuba that the Spanish had heard tales of but were yet to locate. A later writer hoping to embarrass León would concoct a story that he had been tricked into searching for a fantastical fountain of youth, a myth that would stick in the public imagination. León made his way through the Bahamas and on April 2, 1513, landed on a beach in what he thought was a large Bahamian island. In reality, he'd reached not an island but a peninsula, somewhere between what is now Melbourne Beach and St. Augustine. He named the land La Florida, and would continue to explore the coast of much of the peninsula. Save for Spain's colonization of Puerto Rico, which was the beginning of European colonialism in what would become the United States, Ponce de León's landing in Florida marked the very beginning of Europe's colonial project in the eventual 50 states. He would continue returning to La Florida, hoping to cement his control over the peninsula as other Spanish explorers began eyeing the land themselves. Hoping to found a colony, he landed at Charlotte Harbor, a large bay in southwest Florida, where he was killed in a skirmish with the Calusa, ending for several decades Spain's colonial ambitions in Florida. Their next attempt to found a colony in what would be the U.S. mainland was the town of San Miguel de Guadalupe, somewhere on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, which after 2 months failed miserably and was abandoned. Having by this point already founded dozens of colonial towns throughout Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America, even founding a town on the Pacific coast, Panama City, Spain had yet to successfully settle any part of what would become the U.S. mainland. They tried again in 1559. Conquistador Tristan de Luna y Arellano landed at a bay on the Panhandle where he founded the city of Pensacola. Luna's town survived for 2 years until it was destroyed by a hurricane, forcing him and his settlers to evacuate. Pensacola was the first European settlement in the 50 states to survive for multiple years, but though Spain would eventually refound the city, it wouldn't be for more than a century. In 1564, French Huguenots landed at the mouth of the St. Johns River, part of what's now Jacksonville, and founded a town called Fort Caroline. Nervous about a French colony so close to their centers of power in the Caribbean, particularly one settled by Protestants, Catholic Spain sent troops led by Pedro Menendez de Aviles to push out the French. Menendez landed not far to the south and established a base among the Timucua, calling the new town San Agustin, a name that would later be anglicized to St. Augustine. From there, Menendez's men marched on Fort Caroline, took control of the fort, renaming it San Mateo, and massacred the town's hundreds of residents, executing even the many who'd surrendered on account of their Huguenot faith. Unlike the several other prior attempts to settle on the mainland, St. Augustine would be successful. The Spanish built a mission and a fort, and it grew into a thriving town. Its survival makes the city the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the 50 states, second in the U.S. overall, to only the Puerto Rican capital of San Juan. The massive viceroyalty of New Spain was divided into several different colonies called governorates. With the founding of St. Augustine, La Florida became a governorate of its own, with its own colonial administration, St. Augustine serving as the capital. Though Spain claimed control of the entire peninsula, in reality their influence was limited mostly to the north of the state. Around 1639, they founded the town of San Marcos de Apalache in the Panhandle, what would later become known as St. Mark's, and in 1698 refounded Pensacola, guarding it with a series of presidios, or forts. St. Augustine and Pensacola would be Spain's primary colonial towns, and between them they would build a string of more than 120 missions, converting Florida's native people to Christianity and forcing them to farm produce to feed the cities. The largest, Mission San Luis de Apalache, sat where Tallahassee is today. A trail called El Camino Real, the Royal Road, connected San Luis and the other Spanish missions to St. Augustine. For the most part, though, Spain focused their efforts on the resource-rich colonies of Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. La Florida, along with use as ranch land for cattle and ports for ships to resupply, was mostly a useful buffer zone guarding those other more valuable lands, especially as the ever more powerful British expanded their colonial footprint further down the Atlantic coast. The British colony of Georgia was carved out of land where Spain had built Florida missions, and the British, alongside Native American allies, raided and destroyed most of the missions along El Camino Real. Spain increasingly looked weak in Florida. In 1719, French troops captured and occupied Pensacola, returning it later that year but keeping troops in the city for several more years. In 1740, Georgian colonists attacked St. Augustine, and though ultimately unsuccessful, they managed to lay siege to the city for an entire month. For the native people of Florida, the proximity to some of America's first European colonies meant that diseases like smallpox, which they had not been exposed to and had no immunity from, spread rapidly. Florida was hit with these epidemics early, and alongside violence at the hands of the Spanish, it devastated the peninsula's native population. Entire tribes died out, and survivors banded together. In 1763, the French and Indian War, though it saw no major fighting in the state, resulted in Spain losing control of their centuries-old colony. Britain had captured the important port cities of Havana in Cuba and Manila in the Philippines from Spain in the course of the war, and in exchange for these valuable colonies back, Spain gave up Florida to the British. In exchange for that loss, France gave control of their massive colony of Louisiana to their ally Spain, having already lost all their possessions east of the Mississippi to Britain. Now in control of a far larger swath of territory, Britain reorganized Florida, splitting it into two colonies. East Florida, consisting of the entire peninsula and part of the Panhandle up to the Apalachicola River, and West Florida, which included the rest of the Panhandle and parts of the former French Louisiana, stretching all the way to the Mississippi. East Florida's capital would remain in St. Augustine, while Pensacola would serve as the capital of West Florida. There had only been a relatively small Spanish population in the colony, mostly in the two cities, but most would leave after Britain took over, those from St. Augustine relocating to Havana, and those from Pensacola to Veracruz, in what is now the Gulf Coast of Mexico. While in West Florida, cities once part of France like Mobile, much of the pre-war French population remained. Many of the surviving Timucua, Calusa, and other native people of Florida were brought by the Spanish to Havana. Wanting to avoid conflict with Native Americans, Britain banned settlement west of the Appalachians after winning the war, in the so-called Proclamation Line of 1763. They hoped that instead of continuing to push west, British colonists looking for new land would instead move south into their two new colonies. Some did, primarily English and Scots-Irish settlers from Britain's southern colonies like Georgia and the Carolinas. Besides St. Augustine, a new town was founded along the coast. Further south, a Scottish doctor named Andrew Turnbull hoped to develop a massive indigo plantation. He went throughout the Mediterranean to recruit indentured servants, bringing back 1,200 people, including Italians, Greeks from the city of Smyrna, today the Turkish city of Izmir, Corsicans, Spaniards, and in particular Minorcans, the culturally Catalan inhabitants of the Balearic island of Minorca. This group of settlers, who were collectively just called Minorcans, worked in dangerous conditions in Turnbull's settlement, which he called New Smyrna, after the Greek city where his wife and a number of the town's settlers had come from. After a few years, about half of the town's population had died, and the remaining 600 fled and settled in St. Augustine, where they now made up a large proportion of the population and where many of their descendants live to this day. Though a failure, New Smyrna would lend its name to New Smyrna Beach, a city which would later develop on its site. Though some remained, most of the native people who'd inhabited Florida when the Spanish arrived had died or left with them to Cuba, and as British settlers encroached on lands of the Muskogee people in Georgia, many Muskogee began making their way south into Florida and repopulating their abandoned villages, or settling among those previous native people that had survived. Other tribes like the Miccosukee came south into the peninsula as well. Wealthy British colonists built large plantations throughout East and West Florida and brought in enslaved black people from West Africa or their other New World colonies to do the grueling and dangerous work of clearing forests, draining swamps, and farming crops like indigo, cotton, rice, and sugar. These two mostly rural colonies soon had populations that were majority black. To the north, a push for colonial independence was gaining strength. The 13 British colonies weren't the only ones invited. Revolutionary leaders invited other mainland colonies like Quebec and Nova Scotia to the north, and East and West Florida to the south, to send delegations to the Continental Congress as well. But all four were very new British possessions with less of a strong independent identity. East and West Florida in particular had small populations of just a few thousand people, and were dependent on trade with Britain for their economic survival. These colonies declined, their populations mostly remaining loyal to the British Empire. Britain used the Floridas as a military outpost to stage raids across the border into Georgia and hold prisoners of war. For the most part, the two colonies saw little fighting. Spain, still allied with France, joined the war on the side of the revolutionaries and, hoping to take back their former colonies, captured Pensacola, British West Florida's colonial capital. When the war ended in 1783 and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris, Florida would be cut off from Britain's remaining colonies in Canada by the new United States. Instead of bothering to keep the remote colonies, they traded them to Spain for the Bahamas. Under Spain, more settlers flocked to East and West Florida, not just Spanish settlers, but a large number of English-speaking American settlers as well, mostly Southerners of English and Scots-Irish descent. These backwoods frontiersmen ranching cattle in the north would become known as Florida Crackers. Spain kept East and West Florida, which they called Florida Oriental and Florida Occidental, as two separate colonies, though divided by the Suwannee, not the Apalachicola, River. Though some British loyalists had fled, most of the Florida's colonial British populations remained, and Spain now governed a population that was very diverse, but mostly English-speaking. With American immigrants flooding into the two colonies, they would only grow more culturally similar to their northern neighbor and different from their colonial ruler. Descendants of both Florida's original native inhabitants, as well as native Muskogee people from the American South, had formed communities together throughout East Florida in particular. Additionally, they'd taken in large numbers of escaped enslaved black people from Georgia who'd fled across the border. Together, this multi-ethnic population were referred to by the Spanish as runaways, or cimarrones, and as the same word, Simonoli, in the Muskogee language they spoke. From one of these terms came the name of this new Native American people, the Seminole. The Seminole came to dominate much of the central and southern peninsula, which, though claimed by Spain as part of East Florida, was in reality out of their control. Meanwhile, the relationship between Spain and the United States was weakening. The new country was gaining a taste for imperial expansion, doubling in size with the massive Louisiana Purchase. Confusion over the extent of West Florida had led to a border dispute with Spain that was resolved in 1796, but with the Louisiana Purchase a new dispute was born. Britain had reorganized West Florida to include parts of Louisiana, stretching it from the Apalachicola to the Mississippi River, and Spain had continued to govern it as such. Upon buying Louisiana from France, though, the U.S. claimed that half of Spanish West Florida, everything west of the Perdido River, was now rightfully theirs. As many Americans had moved into the Floridas, this border dispute had the potential to erupt. In 1810, a group of American settlers in West Florida took control of the western part of the colony, declaring independence as the Republic of West Florida. After just 2.5 months, though the West Floridians had hoped to negotiate terms with the U.S., American troops marched in and annexed the short-lived country, making it eventually a part of the state of Louisiana. Its Lone Star flag would eventually inspire that of another independence movement from Spain in Texas. In 1812, the United States, hoping to control all of their claims up to the Perdido River, sent ships into Mobile and occupied the rest of the disputed territory. Spain, having lost the entire western half of West Florida, now looked increasingly weak. Meanwhile, Britain, looking to stir the pot between its two rivals, paid bands of Seminoles to launch attacks on American settlers in East Florida. Those attacks, along with the fact that the Seminole were continuing to provide safe harbor for enslaved peoples escaping south across the border, prompted American intervention. Led by General Andrew Jackson, the United States launched the First Seminole War, crossing the border and attacking Seminole towns in Spanish territory and against Spanish disapproval. In 1818, against orders from the U.S. government, Jackson and his troops occupied important Spanish forts in East and West Florida, like St. Mark's, and even occupied Pensacola. President James Monroe was initially furious that Jackson had disobeyed orders, but now saw that they were in a much better position to bargain with Spain. His Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, negotiated a treaty with Spain called the Adams-Onis Treaty, which ceded both East and West Florida to the United States. In Florida, Spain would get nothing other than having claims by American settlers in the Floridas forgiven, though it also resolved a number of other border disputes between the two countries in the West. Many free black Floridians, descended from enslaved people who'd fled there from the north, were now subject to enslavement and fled to Cuba and the Bahamas. The remainders of the two Floridas, now part of the United States, were joined together into one territory of Florida. Long having been two separate colonies, a new capital city was built at a site halfway between Pensacola and St. Augustine, called Tallahassee. White American settlers, mostly from the South, moved into the new territory along with enslaved black Americans, establishing more plantations across the north of the territory and founding towns in the north like Jacksonville. Under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who captured Florida from Spain and served as its first territorial governor, the U.S. tried to remove the Seminole from the state west to Oklahoma to make room for more slave plantations as part of his Indian Removal Act. Pushed south, many Seminoles were forced on steamships from Tampa Bay and the town of Tampa that was developing around the military fort they were sent out from, across the Gulf to New Orleans and upstream to Oklahoma, and an often deadly journey known as the Trail of Tears. Their descendants today live on a reservation just east of Oklahoma City. Many, though, led by a chief named Osceola, resisted removal. After a long and bloody conflict called the Second Seminole War, the U.S. pushed them further south into the Everglades. Most of the territory's settlers and enslaved people lived in the north, whereas in the south, save for some Cuban and Bahamian seafarers, fishers, and treasure hunters, and the swampland controlled by the Seminole, had only one major town, the island city of Key West, a maritime merchant town founded in the Florida Keys hundreds of miles from any other American settlement. Most people lived in agricultural communities in the north of the territory or in towns like St. Augustine, Pensacola, Tallahassee, or Jacksonville, none of which had more than 3,000 residents. In the 1840s, the rural territory surpassed 60,000 people, the population needed to become eligible for statehood. On March 3, 1845, the day before he left office, President John Tyler signed the law admitting Florida into the Union as the 27th state. It was the least populous state in the country. By 1850, Iowa and Texas, admitted after Florida, each had more than double the number of residents. Even small rural states like Vermont and New Hampshire had more people. More war was on the new state's horizon. As settlers were moving into the new state, some were beginning to settle further south into central Florida, in places like the growing port town of Tampa. Conflict broke out once again between settlers and the Seminoles who lived there in 1855. Though not as deadly or as long as the previous conflict, the Third Seminole War broke Seminole control of much of South Florida, which as of yet the U.S. had claimed but did not control. Coastal forts built to drive out the tribe, constructed on a slight rise in the land over the swamps like Fort Dallas and Fort Lauderdale, would mark the onset of later development that would follow in the region. Seizing the rest of the state, the U.S. drove many of the remaining Seminoles to Oklahoma, while others fled deep into the wilds of the Everglades where they couldn't be pursued. With the last of the Seminole Wars over, another larger conflict loomed on the horizon. Tensions between northern and southern states over slavery reached a boiling point with the election of Abraham Lincoln, and in January of 1861, Florida, a rural agricultural state where 44% of the population lived in chains, became the third state to secede from the Union, after just South Carolina and Mississippi, joining the Confederacy a few months later. A remote peninsula, the new state sat far from the main theaters of conflict, and no major battles took place in the state. Perhaps more consequentially than a major cattle ranching state, it supplied much of the beef used to feed Confederate troops. Following the defeat of the Confederacy and Florida's ratification of the Reconstruction Amendments, it became the third Confederate state to rejoin the Union on June 25, 1868, after Tennessee and Arkansas. In northern Florida in particular, slavery would be replaced with sharecropping, a low-wage form of tenant farming that would exploit both black and white Floridians and keep many in poverty. Citrus growing became an important industry, and agricultural towns like Ocala and Orlando were founded deeper into central Florida. In the Gulf Coast town of Tarpon Springs, sponge harvesting was done by Greek immigrants who moved to the city, and today it remains the most Greek-American city in the country. Jacksonville, a growing port city in the mouth of the St. Johns River, joined Pensacola and St. Augustine as one of the largest towns in the state, and, connected to rail lines further north, began attracting northern tourists to its beaches. Though most Floridians lived in the north, the island town of Key West, only accessible by ship, rose to become the largest city in the state. It attracted a naval presence with the military base of Fort Zachary Taylor, built to defend the strategic straits of Florida and push out the pirates who often used the Keys as a safe haven. It became a center of fishing, salt production, and cigar manufacturing, a large population of Cuban immigrants moving to the city to work the cigar industry. After a fire in the city in 1886 destroyed much of its cigar industry, cigar industrialist Vicente Martinez Ybor moved much of his manufacturing to the small bayside town of Tampa, where he developed a cigar manufacturing neighborhood called Ybor City. Immigrants from Cuba, as well as Spain and Italy, flocked to Tampa, which quickly rose to become one of the largest cities in the state. Throughout the 1890s, a Cuban man named Jose Marti began making dozens of trips to Florida. Marti envisioned a Cuba independent from Spain and gave large speeches to the Cuban immigrant communities in Tampa and Key West to build popular support for an uprising. In 1895, he went back to Cuba and launched a revolution, which the Spanish cracked down on. 3 years into the War of Independence, in which Marti was killed, some Americans began pushing for intervention in the revolution occurring just across the Straits of Florida. In 1898, a naval vessel, the USS Maine, left Key West for Havana to protect American citizens living in Cuba. 3 weeks after its arrival, it exploded, killing 268 of the American troops on board. Though the cause of its explosion remains unknown, the public was outraged, and many blamed Spain. It set off an American intervention, not just in Cuba, but against 3 other Spanish colonies, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, each of which the U.S. seized, along with Cuba, though the island that started it all was granted independence just a few years later. Much of the Spanish-American War was launched from Tampa, many of the ships sent to the Caribbean leaving from Tampa Bay. 2 cold winters in the 1890s devastated Central Florida's citrus industry, but in South Florida, a woman named Julia Tuttle, who owned a remote plot of land along a river called the Miami, saw her citrus crops do just fine. Tuttle sent a few blossoms to a man named Henry Flagler, a co-founder of Standard Oil with John D. Rockefeller. The wealthy Cleveland industrialist had begun vacationing in Florida to try to help with his wife's illness and saw an opportunity to transform the state, which with just 391,000 people was the least populous in the South, into a prime vacation destination. Flagler constructed a chain of massive luxury hotels along the Atlantic coast, stretching farther south than development previously had, and connected them with a railroad he built called the Florida East Coast Railway. Towns sprung up around each hotel for the service staff to live in, and other businesses developed to cater to vacationers. Existing cities like St. Augustine, Jacksonville, and Daytona Beach grew significantly with the influx of tourists and vacationers, while new resort towns like Palm Beach and Miami, which Julia Tuttle founded after convincing Flagler to end his rail line and build hotels at her property, were born. Florida was now accessible to wealthy northern tourists, and after the destruction of World War I, rich Americans who previously vacationed in the French Riviera began looking a little closer to home. The Florida East Coast Railway set off a land boom in the state. Other developers, hoping to replicate Flagler's success, began building their own planned communities. The town of Seaside in the Panhandle is a classic example, later gaining fame as the film location for The Truman Show, a master-planned town fitting the premise of the movie quite well. Often developers promoted developments to people across the country without ever having set foot in the state themselves. Vast tracts of land across the state, particularly in South and Central Florida, were converted into huge stretches of suburbia. Swamps were drained to construct massive developments, many of which would eventually become home to hundreds of thousands of people. But unlike most American cities up to that point, these new cities, built for the automobile, would be suburbs without a real city center at all. Its population had begun to climb. By 1920, the Sunshine State was nearing 1 million residents, but this real estate bubble would burst as hurricanes scared off new buyers, sending the local market into a freefall. Even today, in this fast-growing state, there are massive developments from the 1920s that remain unfinished, half-complete casualties of the Florida land boom.
I'm at a cul-de-sac in Northport, Florida, just outside the town of Port Charlotte. In an alternate reality, you'd see suburban homes lining the cul-de-sac, 2-car garages, kids playing in front yards. Instead, I'm hearing the call of birds. I'm surrounded by forests and swamps with not a person in sight. There's grass growing through cracks in the street. Now, 60 years ago, there would have been no development here whatsoever. Northport was built in the 50s and 60s by the developers, the Mackle brothers, who built a number of major cities and towns throughout the state of Florida. In the state, there are a number of cities and towns home to hundreds of thousands of people with no real central business district, mostly suburban and residential areas stretching out over a vast land area. Northport and nearby Port Charlotte are one of them. In some cases, though, these towns were never finished. Canals were dug, roads were paved, but the people never fully moved in. And what looks like a city grid from above is in reality no city at all. While Florida and much of the Sun Belt boomed in the post-war era, in some cases, like here in Northport, development and speculation outpaced the actual growth. Cities were built, but people never showed up, creating what is a really strange situation that's emblematic of a state that has grown so rapidly in the last half-century alone.
It would remain a temporary setback. 400,000 people moved to the state in each of the next 2 decades. After World War II, a growing American middle class had increased economic mobility, and the rise of the automobile and air conditioning made a place like Florida much more appealing to live in year-round. The development of the 20s, it turned out, was no fluke. Florida became an epicenter of an internal migration to the Sun Belt, the warm southern portion of the U.S., from the colder Northeast and especially the industrial Midwest, where manufacturing jobs were moving overseas, and with them, workers sought a new start elsewhere. Northeasterners and Midwesterners flocked to Florida. In 1949, the bays and lagoons separated from the ocean by Florida's barrier islands were connected with a series of canals as part of the Intracoastal Waterway, creating a coastal shipping route that stretched from Massachusetts to Louisiana. During the World Wars, much of Florida's once large black population, many of whom worked low-wage sharecropping jobs in northern Florida, left the poverty and racism of this Jim Crow southern state to better opportunities elsewhere, taking trains to northern industrial cities. Many protested as well to end Jim Crow as part of the civil rights movement. Black Floridians fleeing the state typically went wherever the trains would take them. If they lived in the East Coast, that was to the northeastern cities like New York or Philadelphia, whereas if they lived in the Panhandle, it was likely to Midwestern ones like Chicago or Detroit. From 1900 to 1980, Florida had a larger reduction in the share of the state's population that was black than any other state, from 44 to just 14%. But this is likely mostly due to the fact that so many other people moved into Florida during that same time, more telling of the state's growth than its decline. In terms of sheer numbers, Florida actually gained more black residents during the last century than most other southern states. By 1950, Jacksonville, Tampa, and its twin city of St. Pete and the new resort town of Miami had rapidly become major American cities in their own right, with hundreds of thousands of residents, eclipsing the older towns of St. Augustine, Tallahassee, Pensacola, and Key West. Skyscrapers sprung up in these fast-rising cities. In South Florida, not only were New Yorkers and other Americans from major northeastern cities, including a large Jewish population, moving in, but immigrants were beginning to flock there as well. A communist revolution in 1959 saw Fidel Castro seize power in Cuba, and it would launch waves of mass emigration. 2.9 million Cubans have left the island since, many taking boats or planes to Miami. In the 15 years immediately after the revolution, Greater Miami went from having a small Hispanic population of around 50,000 people to over 500,000, and nearby South Florida cities like West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Hialeah ballooned in population. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion, organized by the United States, was carried out primarily by Cuban exiles living in Miami, many of whom were killed or imprisoned in Cuba afterwards. Haitian immigrants flocked to the city as well, and Miami became a destination, the major port of entry, for immigrants from across the Caribbean and Latin America, from Colombians and Venezuelans to Peruvians, Ecuadorians, and Argentinians to Dominicans, Jamaicans, and Bahamians. It was transformed into a diverse, predominantly Spanish-speaking city. Immigrants with business ties to foreign countries turned it into a major hub of international banking, business, and finance, so while keeping its reputation as a vacation destination, it had become far more than just a small resort town.
My name is Jorge Duany. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute and also professor of anthropology at Florida International University here in Miami. There's been a long-standing historical connection between the peninsula of Florida and the island of Cuba, the archipelago of Cuba, I should say, perhaps more precisely, since the beginning of the Spanish colonial period. And also there's a connection with Puerto Rico since the state of Florida was first discovered and explored by Juan Ponce de Leon, who was the first Spanish governor of Puerto Rico. So some actually quip that the first Puerto Rican migrant was Ponce de Leon himself. Ever since that time, since Florida was named by Ponce de Leon, there has been a connection between Cuba and Florida particularly, but also the broader Caribbean. Cubans began to migrate to Florida from very early on. We begin to see in places like Key West, Tampa, or Ybor City, not Miami at the time, but those two places attracted a large number of exiles from Cuba, as well as workers in the cigar making industry. But it's really the revolution of 1959 that began the largest migration from Cuba, which is still going on. Caribbean Spanish is really the one that dominates here in South Florida, and moreover, it's really Havana Spanish that predominates. Miami really has become the capital of Latin America, in particular the Caribbean, in terms of the trade between the United States and the countries of this region. Tourism is another example. Investment from many of these countries in the real estate market. The establishment of Latin American banks and also other U.S. and other kinds of banks in this area. The financial attraction of Miami, which has become second to New York City in terms of that activity. There's a constant flow of people and merchandise, and you only have to look at the Miami International Airport, which is one of the largest ones in the United States, but also particularly connected to most of the capitals in the region. So here it's Cubans, there's Venezuelans, of course, Colombians, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, almost every other country of Latin America that has sent migrants to the United States has either the first or second major group here of its population based in Miami. And this has really become an interesting phenomenon from a demographic point of view, cultural, political, because after the first 20 years after 1960, which you can call the Cubanization of Miami, you can then call after 1980 or so the Latinization, because actually about half of all Latinos in Miami are now not Cuban. So that has created a more diverse landscape, as well as some rivalry between these groups, for example, for political jockeying in terms of elections.
On July 20th, 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first people ever to set foot on the moon, and their famed Apollo 11 mission had launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida's Cape Canaveral. 2 years later, in 1971, Walt Disney opened one of his signature theme parks, Disney World, in what was then a fairly small farming and military town called Orlando. Though he'd initially planned on putting it in either Tampa or Miami, he thought an inland city would be safer from hurricanes, and the decision would be fateful. In the half-century that followed, Orlando would transform into a major city driven by the tourism industry, home to more theme parks than any other place on the planet, and becoming the most traveled-to city in America. Many Puerto Ricans fleeing hurricanes on the island would resettle in Orlando and its suburbs and make it an epicenter of the lower 48's Puerto Rican community.
I'm Fernando Rivera. I'm a professor of sociology and director of the Puerto Rico Research Hub at the University of Central Florida. In Puerto Rico, there was some financial crisis and all sorts of stuff, but primarily there was a tax law that gave pharmaceuticals a break in their taxes if they established their business in Puerto Rico. But that law, it didn't get expanded in 96 and it sunset till 2006. Businesses will go where the tax breaks are, so they left the island. So it started kind of like in 2006 when the pharmaceuticals went out. Obviously we had the 2008 recession out there, and that if it hit hard in the States, it hit very hard in Puerto Rico and the territories. And then you have bankruptcy, and then you have the hurricane, then you have the earthquakes, then you have COVID. Go back to, let's say, World War II, when there was kind of like the space race, all those type of things. So that was a big draw out here, especially close by to the Space Coast. That drew a lot of engineering and a lot of engineers that came here from Puerto Rico to support that. Prior to that, it was the military out here. A big catalyst was when a certain theme park came into town and transformed this region forever, right? A lot of real estate companies that actually sold land from the Kissimmee area in Puerto Rico. Now, the hospitality type of industry, which offers, very fast entry-level jobs for everyone. This is sort of the closest that it feels to be on the island, being here in Florida. And then people say, it's sort of becoming the 79th municipality of the island of Puerto Rico, right? Because you see kind of like food, festivals, all those type of things, right?
Each decade would see Florida's population continue to soar, to 2.7 million in 1950, to 4.9 million in 1960, now the 10th most populous state, climbing by several million each decade. Just 30 years later, in 1990, it would reach 12.9 million residents and become the country's 4th most populous state, just California, Texas, and New York surpassing it. In 2013, it would overtake New York to become the 3rd most populous state in America. Population growth has continued rapidly during the last few decades, particularly during and after the pandemic, and it remains one of the fastest growing states in America. Since 2020, only 3 counties in the entire state have lost residents. Florida's largest urban area, Miami, is the 4th largest in the country, with 6.08 million people living in a thin stretch of suburbs and cities between the Atlantic and the Everglades, like Hialeah, Boca Raton, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach, stretching all the way up the East Coast from Florida City to Jupiter, often collectively called South Florida. Surpassed by only New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, the city at the mouth of the Miami River on Biscayne Bay has a global reputation, a fast-growing center of international finance and tourism. It's home to 45 skyscrapers, more than any American city besides New York and Chicago, and seaside suburbs like Sunny Isles Beach are lined with strips of tall high-rises themselves. All but 3 of the 45 tallest buildings in the state, including the tallest Panorama Tower, are in Miami or its suburbs. The epicenter of the country's Cuban population, today a third of Miami-Dade County's population is Cuban American, and it's home to huge Haitian American, Puerto Rican, and other communities from across the Caribbean and Latin America, centered in neighborhoods like Little Havana and Little Haiti, but spread throughout the city and its suburbs as well. It remains a major center of immigration today. 41% of Greater Miami is foreign-born, and the only 2 major cities in the U.S. that are majority immigrant, Hialeah and Miami itself, are both in South Florida. The largest city in America founded by a woman, Miami's existence dates back to just 1896, and as such, most of its residents have come from elsewhere. Nicknamed the Gateway to Latin America, it's a bilingual city shaped by not only immigrants, but transplants from northeastern states as well. It's a major city of the country's Jewish community. 7% of the metro area is Jewish. second to only New York City. It's a city of gleaming glass and steel towers, many quite new, and colorful older towers downtown like Freedom Tower, which welcomed immigrants to the city in the second half of the 20th century. Across Biscayne Bay, Miami Beach is a densely built-up barrier island known for its beautiful Art Deco architecture. The city, founded around Henry Flagler's resorts, remains a huge vacation town, bringing in 4 million tourists a year, more than any U.S. city besides New York, and home to the busiest cruise port on the planet. The Port of Miami brings 7.3 million visitors to the city on cruise ships each year. The Bahamian island of Bimini sits just 52 miles east of the city and is accessible by boat. It and nearby Cuba put 2 foreign countries right at the city's doorstep. A major center of the American entertainment industry that's influenced global music and culture, city islands like Star Island, as well as suburbs like Miami Beach and Palm Beach, are home to some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the country. Fisher Island, where the average home price is $5 million, is consistently among the most expensive zip codes in the country. Nestled between 2 national parks, the Everglades and Biscayne, the city sits among an incredibly unique ecosystem, at the edge of a massive swamp and just north of the beautiful Florida Keys. If you want to learn more about Miami, I made a whole video focused on it, which I think you would like. Florida's second largest urban area are the Central Florida twins of Tampa and St. Petersburg, the latter often just called St. Pete. Together home to 2.78 million people, they're the 17th largest urban area in the country and the second largest on the country's Gulf Coast after just Houston. They surround Tampa Bay, an excellent natural harbor boasting the busiest port in the state, the Port of Tampa Bay. Tampa, the urban area's main city, sits on the north end of the bay, while the smaller St. Pete sits 16 miles away on the Pinellas Peninsula, which separates the bay from the Gulf. A former cigar manufacturing town, its Ybor City remains a beautiful red brick historic district not far from downtown, and a beautiful riverwalk lines the Hillsborough River downtown. Home to large Cuban and Italian American populations, the city, not Cuba, was the birthplace of the Cuban sandwich, and it, along with Little Havana and Miami and Key West, are home to wild chickens, descendants of Cuban junglefowl. Along the bay, the smaller St. Pete is home to a high-rise downtown and strings of beautiful white sand beaches on barrier islands along the Gulf. Not far from Tampa in central Florida, Orlando is home to 1.85 million people in it and suburbs like Kissimmee. The city's rise has been rapid, mostly in the few decades since Disney moved in, which received from the state for decades the ability to operate the land around the park as a special taxation zone. More amusement parks have followed, like Universal Studios and SeaWorld, 18 in total, more than any other city in the world, and they've turned Orlando into the biggest tourist destination in the country and a major city in its own right, filled with hotels and resorts that attract 76 million people a year. The city's growth has been so recent that parts of it can still feel like a fairly small southern town. Leafy residential neighborhoods with brick-lined streets and Spanish moss hanging from the trees sit right next to shining skyscrapers around Lake Eola. The city is peppered with dozens of lakes, sitting in the middle of neighborhoods like Orlando and its suburbs. Proportionally the most Puerto Rican major metro area on the mainland, and second in sheer numbers to only New York City, it's the epicenter of the Puerto Rican community in the state with the largest Puerto Rican population. At the very north of the state, near the Georgia border, Jacksonville is perhaps more like a typical southern city than any of Florida's other major cities. Home to 1.25 million people, it's the 4th largest urban area in the state and 40th in the country, though it's Florida's first by population in the city limits. A major port at the wide estuary mouth of the St. Johns River, it's the center of the state's black community and part of the country's Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, an ethnic group of formerly enslaved people in the country's Sea Islands that maintained a number of cultural traditions from West Africa. A skyline of mostly blue skyscrapers line the St. Johns River, and nearby beach towns like Neptune Beach and Jacksonville Beach line the Atlantic coast. Not far outside the city is the wilderness of the Okefenokee Swamp, Amelia Island, one of the Sea Islands, and the historic town of St. Augustine. In terms of race, Florida is one of the most diverse states in the country. 52% of Floridians are white, making it nearly but not quite a majority-minority state. 27% are Latino, the 6th highest proportion of any state and the largest outside the American West. It has the 3rd largest Latino population in the country in sheer numbers. Additionally, 15% of Floridians are black, the 11th largest proportion of any state and the 2nd largest in sheer numbers after just Texas. 3% are multiracial, and 3% are Asian American. Though the Seminole and Miccosukee have a long history in the state and a number of reservations in the Everglades, only 0.12% of Floridians today are Native American. Most Floridians trace their ancestry to enslaved people from West Africa or to Germany, Ireland, Cuba, England, Italy, or Puerto Rico. While in most states, most Latinos trace their ancestry predominantly to Mexico, both Cuban Americans and Puerto Ricans represent larger shares of the population in Florida. The state has by far the largest Cuban American population in the country, home to 2/3 of Cuban Americans, the largest Haitian American population, the third largest stateside Puerto Rican population, and largest in sheer numbers, and among the largest populations of people from most given Latin American and Caribbean nations, as well as the largest Italian American population in the South. 30% of Floridians speak a language other than English at home, the sixth highest proportion of any state, and 21% of Floridians were born in a foreign country. After California, New Jersey, and New York, this is the fourth highest proportion of immigrants of any U.S. state. In terms of religion, 70% of Floridians are Christian and 3% are Jewish, the largest Jewish community outside the Northeast, and the third largest Jewish population in sheer numbers after New York and California. Most Christian Floridians are Protestant, predominantly evangelical, though the state has a significant Catholic population as well. Florida is home to a lot of great regional foods. The Cuban sandwich, it turns out, likely actually originated in Cuban immigrant communities in Tampa, and though its exact origins are uncertain, it's a Florida staple. You can find great Cuban, Haitian, and Puerto Rican food, and delicious cuisine from really all around the Western Hemisphere in the state, like Bahamian conch fritters. It's a great place for seafood in general, from crab to lobster to shrimp to tons of different varieties of fish. Alligator meat is a Florida classic. Gatorade itself was actually created at the University of Florida to help their football team, the Gators, during games. A big citrus growing state, Floridians take great pride in their orange juice, and key lime pie is from the Florida Keys. The vast regional differences across the state mean Floridians speak with an array of different accents and dialects. Southern accents are more common in the north, particularly the Panhandle, while further south, Floridians sound more like Americans from northern states. In the Miami area, the prevalence of the Spanish language has led a new accent and dialect called Miami English to develop, with phrases being translated word for word from Cuban Spanish into spoken English, such as get down from the car instead of get out of the car, or made a party instead of threw a party. Music genres from country and rock to reggae and Latin music have been influenced by Florida, and Miami has a prominent rap scene. Ultra in Miami is one of the largest music festivals in the country. Florida has 11 Major League sports teams across all 5 professional sports leagues. Miami is home to 5 teams: the NHL's Florida Panthers at Amerant Bank Arena, the NFL's Miami Dolphins at Hard Rock Stadium, the NBA's Miami Heat at the Kaseya Center, the MLS's Inter Miami CF at Chase Stadium in Fort Lauderdale, and the MLB's Miami Marlins at Lone Depot Park. Orlando is home to 2 teams. The NBA's Orlando Magic play at the Kia Center, and the MLS's Orlando City SC at the Inter and Coast Stadium. The Tampa area is home to 3 teams, each of which go by Tampa Bay to appeal to both Tampa and St. Petersburg. The NFL's Tampa Bay Buccaneers at Tampa's Raymond James Stadium, NHL's Tampa Bay Lightning at Tampa's Amalie Arena, and the MLB's Tampa Bay Rays at St. Pete's Tropicana Field, though they're currently playing at Steinbrenner Field in Tampa, the spring training site for the New York Yankees, after Hurricane Milton ripped the roof off of Tropicana Field. In Jacksonville, the NFL's Jacksonville Jaguars play at Everbank Stadium. Baseball spring training is big in Florida. Every MLB team trains in either Florida or Arizona and plays exhibition games against one another there. The Florida teams are known as the Grapefruit League, and their stadiums crisscross Central and South Florida. I went to a few games with my dad, and it was fun to just see how many Florida fans there were of teams from some of these northern cities where a lot of Floridians have moved from. The largest newspapers in the state are the Tampa Bay Times in St. Petersburg, the Miami Herald, Orlando Sentinel, South Florida Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale, the Palm Beach Post, Florida Times Union in Jacksonville, the Sarasota Herald Tribune, and the Daytona Beach News Journal. The busiest airport in the state is the Orlando International Airport, followed by the Miami International Airport. The two are the 7th and 10th busiest airports in the country, respectively. Additionally, the Fort Lauderdale-Hollywood International Airport, Tampa International Airport, Southwest Florida International Airport in Fort Myers, and the Palm Beach International Airport each bring in millions of passengers each year. The state is home to 3 of the country's 10 largest universities. The University of Central Florida in Orlando and its 68,000 students has the 4th largest enrollment in the United States. The University of Florida in Gainesville is the country's 5th largest university, and Florida International University in Miami is the 8th largest. Other major universities in the state include the University of South Florida, which interestingly enough is in Tampa, Miami-Dade College, and Florida State in Tallahassee. Major companies headquartered in Florida include World Fuel Services, Publix, Lennar, CSX, FIS, AutoNation, Ryder, Hertz, TD SYNNEX, Citadel, Carnival, and Carrier Global. Famous Floridians include Pitbull, Sidney Poitier, Burt Reynolds, Kodak Black, Gilbert Arenas, Fred Durst, Ariana Grande, Lamar Jackson, Wesley Snipes, Sofia Vergara, A. Philip Randolph, Camila Cabello, Jason Derulo, Ray Charles, Josh Gad, Dwayne Johnson, DJ Khaled, Sean Kingston, Pat Boone, Denzel Curry, Angela Bassett, Hulk Hogan, Maya Rudolph, Tom Petty, Zoe Kravitz, Enrique Iglesias, Tim Tebow, Christian Slater, Rick Ross, the Van Zant Brothers, XXXTentacion, Bob Ross, Billy Mays, Flo Rida, Gloria Estefan, Carl Hyacin, and Steve Aoki. No presidents have come from Florida, but several have had a connection to the state. Andrew Jackson, who was born in the Carolinas and built his political career out of Tennessee, briefly served as Florida's first territorial governor after winning the territory from Spain. Harry Truman, a Missourian, vacationed regularly in Key West during his presidency in a residence nicknamed the Little White House. Like many New Yorkers, Donald Trump moved to Florida after his first term, officially changing his residence to the Sunshine State. Because of this, his second term will technically mark the first time a Florida resident has ever been inaugurated president, despite the fact that most of his life and career has been based out of New York. In recent years, his Palm Beach estate, Mar-a-Lago, has served as something of a power center in Republican politics, a site for meetings with American politicians and foreign leaders. The state has undergone a major political shift in recent years. It was long perhaps the most competitive purple state in the country. It was decisive in victories for Bush, Obama, and Trump, and was in the 2000 election the site of a hotly contested recount. George W. Bush's victory over Al Gore in the state came down to just a few hundred votes, well within the margin for a recount, and the election overall was so close that Florida's electoral votes would determine who won and who lost. After a long and contentious recount process, a month after the still undecided election, the Supreme Court ordered the recount to stop, handing the election to Bush. His .009% margin of victory was the closest any state has ever voted in any American presidential election ever. In recent years, though, Florida has undergone a significant rightward shift. Donald Trump won the state in both 2016 and 2020 by margins of less than 2% and 4%, respectively, but in 2024 won by a 13% margin, even carrying several urban counties. It remains to be seen whether this is a long-term trend, but for now, Florida seems to be more of a red than a purple state. Its Cook Partisan Voting Index is currently R+3, meaning that in a given presidential election, the Republican candidate tends to outperform the national average by 3%, though this measurement hasn't yet taken into account the 2024 election. Of its 28 representatives in the House of Representatives, 20 are Republicans and 8 are Democrats. Its governor, Ron DeSantis, is a high-profile Republican who ran for president in 2024 but lost to Donald Trump. Its 2 senators, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, are both Republicans. Rubio, himself a 2016 presidential candidate, will soon be replaced as senator should he pass confirmation as Trump's Secretary of State. That is it for Florida. It won't be the most populous state in this series for long because up next is an even bigger one. That's right. Texas is the next state I'm covering in the US Explained. If you're from Texas, please respond to my community post or my comment here to let me know what you'd like to see included about your home state. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as quarterly channel newsletters, thumbnail previews, early access to maps I create, and shoutouts to my videos such as these. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He made the great intro at the beginning of this video that I'll use in all the US Explained videos, so go show him some support. I tried to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things I missed as there was a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Florida who helped give me information for this video. I truly would not have been able to make it without all your help. I really enjoyed visiting Florida as part of my 6-month-long filmmaking trip across the country. From here on out, every single video in the US Explained will feature on-site clips and footage I filmed in that state. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.